You mentioned Marx's view of history. It's kind of interesting to just briefly talk about. What do you think of it? What do you think of this Marxist view of how the different systems evolve from the perspective of class struggle, as we were talking about?
Well, I'm a Marxist. I fundamentally believe in the broad contours of historical materialism, but I think we should be clear of what Marxist theory tells us and what it doesn't tell us. I think Marxist theory tells us pertinent things about how societies evolve, about how the distribution of resources work in any given society, who owns, who doesn't, how the distributional conflicts, and so on. I think Marxism can tell us a lot.
How surplus is distributed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. What it can't tell us is as a friend put it, like a sex appeal of blue jeans or whatever else. That's beyond what Marxism is meant to do.
What economic system can tell us about the sex appeal of blue jeans?
No economic system, but socialism, in the Soviet sense, when it was turned into the Soviet style dialectical materialism, was meant to tell us everything from explain genetics and agriculture and whatever else in a very disastrous way. So I definitely don't believe in the application of these ideas in an extremely wide way. And also, I'm a Marxist because it's a framework that helps me understand pertinent facts about the world. If at some point I no longer think the framework is doing that, I will not be a Marxist. But I'm a socialist on normative grounds because I have certain beliefs about the equality of people, because I believe we should have a society with liberty, with equality, with fraternity, and that I hope I'll always be a socialist until the day I die. But it's kind of a very unscientific or unserious thing to say, oh, this is my framework from beginning to end, for the rest of my life.
But from a perspective of history, you should say that, so Marx says that societies go through different stages. It could be crudely summarized as primitive communism, imperialism, maybe slave society, feudalism, defined by mercantilism, and then capitalism, then socialism, and finally stateless communism. Did I miss something there?
I mean, I think that was close enough. I mean, I think that's definitely true of Marxist theory, that the contradictions of capitalism, the fact that it has brought together all these workers, all these materials and whatever else, and it's now allowing it to socially create wealth on a mass scale, but that process is being privately directed, and also the surplus is being privately kind of appropriated, is a contradiction. And that would lead to some sort of rebellion or revolution or change, and eventually this contradiction would be a fetter on production too. So we would have to move into a socialist society.
But actually, just to backtrack, so in terms of contradiction, so it starts when we're in a village, hunter-gatherers. That's what you call primitive communism, where everyone's kind of equal. It's kind of a collective, right? All right, maybe you could just let me hold on a second. And then inequalities form of different flavors. So that's what imperialism is. This one dude rises to the top and has some control of different flavor. That's what feudalism when you have one dude at the top and you have merchants doing some trading and so on. And then that leads to capitalism when you have private ownership of companies, and they result in some kind of class inequality. And then eventually that results in a revolution that says, no, this inequality is not okay. It's not natural. It doesn't respect the value of human beings. And therefore it goes to socialism, where there is, under Marx's view, I guess, some role for the state. State is doing some redistribution, and then the pure communism at the end is when it's it's a collective where there's no state centralized power.
So
what's part of that is wrong?
No, I think in broadly the Marxist theory of history is about different modes of production that exist at various times, based on material condition. So in the early times in this theory, there was not much surplus being generated, right? And there was generally egalitarian societies. Then, as we became agricultural, as society developed, there was more surplus being produced. Then there was a group of people, the ruling classes of their age, that controlled and distributed that controlled that division of labor and appropriated more of that surplus for themselves, and they weren't involved in productive labor. In early primitive society, everybody's involved in productive labor. Later on, you had castes of priests who did nothing but kind of pray and write and kind of lecture people all day, right? And you had kings and rulers and bureaucrats and traders and so on. You have a more complex division of labor, but also more inequity deriving out of that. Capitalism was a revolutionary system because it took away, one, it made us tremendously more productive, right? It expanded production beyond our wildest imaginations, but it also no longer bound workers to their lord or manor or whatever else. They were now free to move, free to engage in contracts with employers and so on. But even though workers are now producing all this tremendous wealth, and even though productive forces had been matured in such a way, they were ultimately taken away from all the wealth they were created. They got some of it back. They were in wealthy societies, but they were all there collectively together producing this wealth. And that was a potent force. So Marx theorized that would lead to a revolution or change in a socialist direction. I think, in fact, what we saw was that, yes, workers are dependent on capitalists are dependent on workers, but the dependency is obviously symmetrical in the sense that workers are also dependent on capitalists. But in fact, it's an asymmetrical dependency in that ordinary workers need their jobs more than capitalists need the contribution of individual workers. So it became kind of a collective action problem where you would need the mass of workers to get together to decide to change things, but also people would be afraid because they'd be dependent on their jobs for their livelihood and so on. So revolution became a lot harder than people thought, especially in democratic countries where workers had certain outlets and certain powers and rights and responsibility. You know, it's no surprise that where you did have socialist revolutions, they were in places like the third world, colonial states trying to emerge out of colonialism. They were in places like, China and Russia, autocratic countries, and never in a advanced capitalist country. Now, in Marxist theory of history, even as interpreted by a lot of smart Marxists like G.A. Cohen and others, there is a certain inevitability to socialism after capitalism. The way that I would put it myself is I kind of have a more, I guess you could say, like Kantian view of it. Like, I think socialism is something that ought to happen, but it's not something that necessarily will happen. And we'll need to organize and persuade, and also potentially, again, the key part of any social system that's democratic is you have to allow for the possibility of a democratic revision to a different sort of system. So I'd be more than happy in my vision of socialism for there to be capitalist parties getting, hopefully 3, 4, 5% of the vote, maybe a lot more. In the same way that in the US, a republic, we could right now have a monarchist party. No one's going to support a monarchist party in the US in serious numbers.
Although that's gaining popularity.
In Europe or elsewhere?
No, isn't there in the anarchist tradition? Aren't they saying that one of the ways you could have a leaders in monarchy because they're more directly responsible to the citizens? If you have a leader, it's healthier to have a monarch. Anyway, I'm not familiar with this, but I have heard this stated multiple times.
The left-wing anarchist traditions, like anarcho-syndicalism or whatever else, like their slogan is kind of no kings, no gods, no masters or whatever.
Yeah.
So no bosses. So they definitely would not agree with that. But I'm not familiar enough. Anarchism is runs a gamut from left to right in interesting
I'll
ways.
I'll
So
I'll I'll have to ask about
yeah.
I'll have to ask you about that. But yeah, okay. So you're not, you don't believe Marx's theory of history in the sense that every stage is a natural consequence of every other stage. Of course, he would predict that somebody like you must exist in order for those stages to go from one to the next, because you have to believe ought in order for action to be taken, to inspire the populace to take action.
So two things. One is I do broadly believe in Marxist theory of history because it's just explaining how productive forces develop and the relations of production in any given system. I guess there's a theory of transition from capitalism to socialism that Marx didn't really spell out, but it was kind of implied that it would naturally happen. And Marx was living in an era of tremendous upheaval. Marx himself actually saw when he was living in London in the 1870s, the Paris Commune, when workers took over for just a few months, but they took over, the producers of Paris took over the city, basically created their own government, their own system, and so on. So he was living through an era of upheaval. And Engels, especially, oversaw and was the mentor to all these rising socialist parties. So he was very closely collaborating with socialists in places like Britain and Germany when they were drafting their first programs for the Social Democratic Party. So it felt like this was going to happen. It felt like this rising working class would take power. But I think the stability of the system was underestimated. It's easy to see the contradictions in the system, but can you see its mechanisms of stability? The way in which mass collective action or revolutions more the exception or the norm. Could you have imagined, if you're Marx, not only how much wealth the system would produce over time, which I think he could have imagined, but also developments like the welfare state and mass democracy and universal suffrage, which might have changed how workers relate to the system or operate within it. So I think it's just the transition part that I think wasn't spelled out properly. But I think in either case, as socialists, we can assume that history is working in our favor. We just need to kind of hold out and wait for the inevitable revolution. We have to convince people of both, one, the struggle for day-to-day reforms and why it's important to be politically organized, why it's important to be a member of a union or to advocate for things like universal healthcare or whatever else, to try to kind of build the cohesion and sense of self of the class. Then ultimately, for the desirability, once we accomplish it, once we build social democracy, of going beyond social democracy, which is, of course, the challenge. Now, I don't think it requires leadership from the outside. I think there are plenty of organic leaders that have emerged from the working class that have advocated for socialism from the working class. And if you look at the class composition during the glory days of the European socialist parties, I mean, this was very much a working class parties and organizations. It's only been the last 30 years that it's been taken over by professionals, and not uncoincidentally, they have accomplished very little in those 30 years.